History Spotlight, brought to you by HEC Media and the Missouri Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell, president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, and this is History Spotlight. St. Louis has a rich and complex election history, reflecting the city's evolving political landscape from the 19th century to the present. Chris Gordon, MHS's Director of Library and Collections, explains.
Americans of all political persuasions can agree that voting is essential and that exercising one's right to vote makes a difference. Still, how we've cast our ballots hasn't always looked the same. Voting laws and practices have evolved as our nation has evolved. In 1805, after the Louisiana Purchase brought the lands west of the Mississippi under the control of the United States, the territory of Louisiana was created as the first territorial government in Missouri. With the new government, the territorial legislature established our region's first democratic elections. This marked an important step in the development of democratic practices in the newly acquired territories. Then, with Missouri's admission to the Union in 1821, citizens could participate even more directly in selecting elected officials and adopting new laws. At this time, and for much of the 19th century, voting procedures were quite rudimentary. Voters used pre-printed ballots or pieces of paper which were marked and then dropped in a ballot box. Since illiteracy was widespread within the general population, these ballots often used symbols to help voters identify respective candidates, which is how we came to use the familiar elephant and mule symbols for Republicans and Democrats. After casting ballots, the count was determined by checking the number of names in the poll book against the number of ballots in the box. An election judge appointed by a local official recorded voter names in a poll book, and each voter had to swear an oath of eligibility. They had to attest that they fulfilled voting requirements, such as proving that their taxes had been paid and that they were U.S. citizens. Immigrants, for instance, were required to bring naturalization papers to verify their citizenship. We must still attest to citizenship and residency laws when we go to vote, but other early eligibility practices, such as property ownership, were dropped by the mid-19th century. Of course, only white males were allowed to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, which expanded that right to African American men in 1870. And finally, the 19th Amendment ensured the right to vote to women in 1920. Where we go to vote has also changed. Polling places in those early decades were often informal, located in taverns or a country store, sometimes a courthouse, and election days often had the feel of a celebration or a festival. In St. Louis, political parties might hold torch-lit parades and shoot off fireworks while waving banners that promoted their candidates. And of course, there was always plenty of alcohol for the thirsty. Candidates took advantage of the proximity of polling places to taverns to buy barrels of whiskey and cider to fill the glasses of potential voters. However, as the years progressed and attitudes changed towards mixing alcohol and political campaign practices, voting became much more solemn and voting laws became more standardized. A significant shift occurred in 1845 when federal law established a national election day on the first Tuesday in November. Before this new federal legislation, states were allowed to set their own presidential election days as long as they were held before the first Wednesday in December. Therefore, unlike modern elections, where we often see the results very soon after or on election night, you had to wait until all the states had voted, the votes were tallied and reported to Congress, and the winners were certified. It would have made for some very long watch parties. There have been a few examples of very problematic election days. For example, in St. Louis in August 1856, Election Day turned violent. Anti-immigrant nativist groups, fueled by fears of illegal voting by non-naturalized immigrants, attacked the homes of Irish and German immigrants, the newspaper offices of St. Louis's German language newspaper, and even St. Louis University, because it was a Catholic university and associated with Catholic immigrants. The violence was severe enough to involve the local militia, who were called in to control the streets after running gun battles erupted. Such conflicts were notable exceptions, though. Over time, more standardized balloting practices and new election laws helped to reduce confrontations. In 1914, the Missouri Supreme Court upheld a law prohibiting liquor sales and bars and nightclubs from opening on Election Day, reflecting the influence of the Prohibition movement. This decision aimed to prevent disruptions and ensure a sober electorate. In St. Louis, which wasn't much of a Prohibition town, these laws were still enforced. But the St. Louis Post-Dispatch lamented on election days, quote, "St. Louis became a Sahara." These liquor laws remained on the books in Missouri until well after Prohibition was over. It was in the 1980s that these Prohibition-era laws began to be relaxed and repealed. Fears surrounding potential disruption at polling places continued to be a concern, though. In 1932, amid the Great Depression, St. Louis city officials took measures to police polling places more rigorously. Officers were stationed at each polling place to discourage potential violence or disruptions. They were ordered to watch for concealed weapons, enforce laws against electioneering within 100 feet of the polls. Today it's within 25 feet of the polls. And they were instructed to, quote, "arrest all drunks." The one thing that hasn't changed is that it is important to remember that the right to vote is one of the cornerstones of our democracy. Each election is an opportunity to have your voice heard. Throughout history, Americans have cherished the right to vote. And on Election Day, we should emulate those who fought to uphold those rights and expand the right to vote to those who were originally disenfranchised on Election Day.
Next week on History Spotlight, a look at the history of Soldiers Memorial and Memorial Plaza.
To learn more about the Missouri Historical Society, visit mohistory.org.